You ever stop to think what the word culture means? Wonder what goes through people's heads when they hear that word. I suspect some people think in terms of high culture. So to you, culture might mean Wagnerian grand opera with a soprano in a Minnesota Vikings horned helmet standing on the stage singing about the old Norwegian gods up in Valhalla. Or maybe you think a little bit more like an anthropologist. And to you, culture is, well, that's a tribe of pygmies going through the jungles of Africa with spears looking for whatever people look for in the jungles of Africa. Or maybe if you're like a lot of people, I suspect that culture is just what people use to make yogurt. When I think of culture, what actually comes to mind is the movie The Matrix. If you've seen that movie, then you know The Matrix is that, procession of green characters that comes down and surrounds us in every aspect of our lives, controls us in everything that we do, and we never even see it. And to me, culture is the same. It's something we don't see. The culture that we see is what we see when we're someplace else, not in our home culture, and we see the differences. So there you are, you're a tourist in Italy, and you go, holy smoke, Italians drive with a great deal of enthusiasm. Germans sure eat a lot of sausage. Or somebody's visiting here, and you notice how different they are from you. And so to me, culture is what the other guy has. We almost never see our own. Let me give you a couple of examples. When the American president travels, how does he, or let's face it, someday soon, probably she, get around? Air Force One, of course. The American president has his very own Boeing 747 to travel around the world in. And American culture says, that makes sense. It's a terrific reflection of American power and influence. So our culture says that's a good thing. Do you have any idea how the Prime Minister of Australia travels? If Malcolm Turnbull needs to fly from Sydney to London, he flies commercial. Now, as it happens, he's sitting in the first-class cabin of an Airbus A380, but he gets on Qantas flight QF1, sits down, and does up his seatbelt, and flies to London with a stopover in Dubai, along with 450 of his fellow Australians. It's a little different. Australian culture is unusually egalitarian. They have an expression called the tall poppy syndrome. And tall poppies in that model tall poppies are things that get their heads lopped off. And so that culture is so egalitarian that not even the Prime Minister should have his own airplane. Otherwise it'd be a tall poppy. We don't notice our culture about how our president travels. They don't notice their culture about how their prime minister travels. It's only when you look at the other guy that you see what the cultural difference is. Now, one of the joys of my life is that because I teach public health, I get to travel around the world and work in underserved areas with fragile populations that get very little health care. I would like to think I'm reasonably well prepared for this. I'm a pharmacist by training. I know something about medication. I know something about healthcare. I've studied global health. I know something about the culture and social aspects of healthcare. And yet, every time I travel, I find myself struggling with cultural aspects of health that I'm really trying to figure out what to do. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is a picture I took in Honduras a couple of years ago. This was the pharmacy that I worked in during a medical trip to rural Honduras. And I was working with a Honduran pharmacist there, and all we did was fight. We had an American family practice physician on our team who was working in our women's health clinic, and she diagnosed several cases of what appeared to be pelvic inflammatory disease. Pharmacists are kind of weird. We figure out what's wrong with patients by looking at what was prescribed and having to work it out backwards. So it looked like PID, and pelvic inflammatory disease, if you are not familiar with it, is a serious disease of the female uterus that if it's not treated properly and not treated effectively, can have a lot of really serious complications, including infertility. And so my American physician colleague would prescribe some meds that she thought was suitable for this condition. I would fill the prescriptions, and every single time my Honduran counterpart, who had to check my work because I'm working under her license in that setting, every single time she took out the medication that I so carefully dispensed and replaced it with something else that I was absolutely certain was not going to be effective. And we argued and we fought and we got into it day after day, and it doesn't really matter what I wanted, she did what she wanted every single time. I have absolutely no idea what was going through her head. My guess is that she saw a English-speaking white American college professor old enough to be her father as some sort of a threat to her authority or knowledge base. I don't know that, that's what I'm guessing. What I am pretty sure about is that when all was said and done, there are probably several women that are currently walking around Honduras today no longer able to bear children because of what went on in that clinic. It bothers me to this day. This is the village of Nanakaneba in Mali. Mali is a country in West Africa. It is one of the poorest countries in the world. The Human Development Index for Mali is ranked 179th in the world. The last country ranked is 188. There's not much room between them and the bottom. There's no electricity in this village. Running water only arrived about 5 years ago. Cell phone service is pretty sketchy. People live on an average of less than $700 per person per year. Life expectancy is 58 years. And weirdly enough, I love it there. The people are so incredibly kind. They welcome us. They make us feel at home. If there's ever any kind of a celebration in the village, we're always invited. And so one night, we were invited to a celebration. And there was a lot of singing, and there was dancing, and people were banging on drums, and everybody looked really, really happy. And we were absolutely horrified to find out that this celebration was to celebrate the fact that the next morning, one of the 12-year-old girls in the village was to undergo female genital mutilation. We were shocked. No idea what to do. So we just sort of skulked back to our beds, went to sleep for the night, went to clinic the next morning and tried to pretend nothing had happened. This is what I call traveling while culturally incompetent. I thought I had some cultural skills. I thought I had some skills that would work with me while traveling in a foreign country. And it turned out that when I got inland, they weren't that helpful after all. So when we send students abroad here as part of their education, or if you've ever volunteered on any kind of a medical mission trip, you've probably been approached with the fact that you should probably get some preparation in becoming culturally competent. So there may be books that you would read, or role plays that you would engage in, conversations that you may have, journal articles that you would read. And we would like to believe that when we do this, we're sending people abroad who are prepared for this kind of work. And we're kind of dubious that we are. The one thing you find working in global health is that you're often having to make decisions quickly and under very imperfect circumstances. So what decision should I have made when faced with a Honduran pharmacist who, in my view, was being both irresponsible and irrational? What should I have done when faced with that celebration? Everything I've ever learned about culture says the same thing. You don't substitute your culture for somebody else's. Every culture on this planet is equally valid. Yours isn't better than mine. Mine isn't better than yours. They're just different. So it's taken me years to try and figure out how to handle these kinds of problems. I would acknowledge the fact that Honduran culture is no better or worse than mine. I would acknowledge the fact that Malian culture is no better or worse than mine. But I also have to acknowledge the fact that untreated pelvic inflammatory disease is nothing to be trifled with, and that depriving a woman of her means of sexual expression really is something that can do damage to one of the most fundamental rights of what it takes to be a human being. So what am I supposed to do? No clear answer there. And it's taken me years to kind of figure out what to do with this. And so I've finally come to the working conclusion, I don't think I'm done with this yet, that when I'm in your country and we disagree, or I don't understand, I'm wrong. Full stop. Now, that leads to some potential pushback, which is not unreasonable. People may reasonably say, well, when you're faced with something like that, you're obligated to do something about it. That's true. But you have to think it through. If you're in another country working in a global health capacity, and you push back too hard on something like this, yeah, I may be able to get something changed in terms of a medical decision or some cultural activity that's going on. But I also run the risk of being thrown out of town and told not to come back next year. And then we have the problem of whatever medical benefits we may be able to deliver while we're here aren't going to happen. Things come at a cost. And so where I go with this is, and this is a provisional working method in my mind. If I'm in your country, we're disagreeing, I don't understand, I'm wrong. And my thought for that is, we're not in my country. These are not my people. We're not practicing under my license. This isn't my culture. I don't know that that's a particularly good solution. I'm perfectly prepared to get pushback on that from some people. But at least at this point, it seems to be something serviceable. I'm more than prepared to make changes in that as I get more experience traveling the world and working in these kinds of circumstances. But so far, so good. Now, I don't want to leave you with the thought that anytime you ever volunteer on any kind of a mission-type trip or go abroad, that horrible things are about to happen that you're going to have difficulty managing. This is a photograph of Adama Keita. Adama is a traditional Malian healer, also in non-academic Mali. And I had maybe the most interesting half hour of my career about 2 years ago interviewing him. Kind of going into that, I'd always thought, well, I gotta believe that the differences between us would be so wide as, how do you bridge that gap? I mean, a traditional Malian healer versus, Western medicine with all its resources and education behind it. And at first that seemed to be the case. So I asked him, I said, well, what kind of things do you treat? He said, well, I treat a lot of malaria. That made sense. So did we when we were over there. But he also treats bad luck. And he treats people who wish to have better success in marriage or in the workplace. That's kind of interesting. And then the real kicker, he treats a surprising amount of demonic possession. People who are walking through the village and think they've seen a devil. So he treats them with that. Then I looked at, well, what kind of things do you use to treat people? And that seems so different as well. This is called sorrel. It's a cow's horn, and inside that horn is some powder that he has prepared and a little stick. And so if one of his patients is traveling through the village in Anakineba and she thinks she sees a devil, just dips the stick into the powder, draws a strap across her forehead, poof, the devil disappears. I've never seen a devil in Mali at all, so I'm assuming it works. Or not. The correlation versus causation, you should know that. This is a treatment called the names of God. Mali is an Islamic culture, And as I understand it, Islam has 99 names for God. God the loving, God the sublime, and similar terms like that. So what he has done here is he's written down the names of God in Arabic. And what a patient does is that she takes those names of God, mixes them with the leaves from a tree, mixes them with water, and applies them like a lotion. Wow, talk about different. So at that point I'm thinking, well, just there are such differences here, how are we going to get past this? And then all of a sudden it seemed to be kind of a window into some opportunity for communication that we would have together. I asked him how he became a healer. And he said, well, I studied under 3 masters in both Arabic and Bambara for 15 years. And I thought, wow, it's taken this guy the same length of time to become a traditional Malian healer as it taken an American to become an orthopedic surgeon. This guy is as much an expert in his world as I am in mine. So then I asked him, well, there's a village nurse here who practices Western style medicine. Do you ever get in conflict with him? And he said, no, we refer patients to each other. So he makes referrals the same as an American doc would do. And then we talked a little bit about practice. If you're learning to become a healthcare practitioner here, you learn there are knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are applied in a certain fashion, and that's what practice consists of. And it turned out his practice was identical to mine. The way he gathered and used information and made decisions about patient care is the same as I would teach my own students. He treats a lot more demonic possession than I do. But it's the same. And at that point I thought, well, what do I learn about being culturally incompetent while traveling? Well, sometimes I'm just not going to know. I'm going to be in over my head. You're going to know something that I don't, either clinically or culturally, and I am just going to have to own my ignorance and own my incompetence at that point and hope that you have either the clinical or the cultural skills to solve this problem, because I can't. But there are other times when it turns out we have more stuff in common than we thought. We just have to find out what that looks like. And at that point, every now and again, cross fingers, maybe I'm not quite as culturally incompetent as I thought.